Okay, so welcome. Today is May 1st, 2023. Happy Beltane for folks who celebrate. Happy International Workers' Day, May Day, Labor Day in most of the world. And I like to begin the events that I'm guiding. I'm Daniel 4. Hi, probably got that. I like to begin with a prayer. So I'm going to do it that way. And whatever helps you to just be in presence and gift yourself with the hour of time, that's great. Give acknowledgement to the holy mystery and source of life within and through each of us. I give acknowledgement to my own ancestors of blood and to the other powers that support my life. I give acknowledgement and praise to the land here in La Subia, Granada, Andalusia, and the elder beings whose bodies are this land and the ancestors here and the people here. I give acknowledgement to all those who are struggling right now and all those who are deep in conflict in a way that compromises their basic safety. I give acknowledgement to all those who are flooded with inner conflict and really beyond their capacity. May we hold the spirit of kindness and care for all the difficulty as we turn our attention for this hour to how to bring a spirit of reverence and courage and clarity to the topic of conflict. Thanks for my life and for the tech, and may it be a useful and kind teaching. Shame. So hi, welcome everybody. We have an hour together and the focus is embracing inner and outer conflict. And the guiding question is as follows. What supports you to welcome the conflict that's actually in service to your destiny? Like, what helps you to wade in where it's needed and turn toward what's difficult? It's a big question, right? But the intent here is to say some things in the hour that we have, do a little experiential practice, allow a little bit of time for questions around this topic of how to bring a so-called spiritual perspective or animist, earth-honoring perspective to the topic of conflict. So there'll be plenty to say, right? Before we dive into all that, briefly, I want to say a few things about what's happening with ancestral medicine. There's a course that starts a week from now, on Monday, May 8th, that I'm guiding, a 4-session short course called Skills for Healthy Boundaries in Conflict, which is deepening and expanding into the kind of things we'll be talking about today, and how to bring a non-dual, an earth-honoring, a sacred and grounded, psychologically informed perspective to conflict and boundaries. And then there's a course that's open for just a few more days that's already just begun called Loving the Earth, Practical Animism, Skills for Relationship, which is related to what we're talking about here because it's about bringing a very relational framework to including topics that are conflictual and difficult, but overall coming back into relationship with the earth and land. And then the other two things that are open right now through ancestral medicine are the Ancestral Lineage Healing course, which is our most popular course, and the practitioner training for folks drawn to guide ancestral healing practices for others as part of a thing you're doing in the world. And then there's our whole archive of self-paced courses. So lots of things happening. If you're moved by any of that, come on in. Be happy to have you with us. So before I try to say a thing, let me situate myself. I know a lot of you have, we've met or we've been in a talk or something, but some of you are new and some of you are listening in after. And so I think it's nice etiquette in a public talk to situate myself briefly in light of the content. So I'm personally down lineage from early English and German settler colonialist folks to North America, what later became the United States. And I live now in Andalusia in southern Spain with my wife and our 2 young girls. We moved here in the fall, and I'm very happy to be here. And but I'm from the U.S., so it's my background and ancestrally Northern Western European. I'm a doctor of psychology. I have a background as a therapist, but mostly I'm a ritualist, and that's been my main focus in the last 25, 30 years. What's perhaps relevant to tease out here is because I have been conditioned as an American cisgendered middle-class PhD educated white guy. It means I'm conditioned to generally be confident whether or not I know what the hell I'm doing. And I got that modeled for me from my dad as well. And it's not all bad, but it also tends to go along with the conditioning of being a dismissive ass or arrogant toward other people. That's like the default American white dude imperialist conditioning, unless it's addressed. And I believe I've, it's ongoing, but I've certainly given some care to try to shift that. And but that'll inform how I approach this topic of conflict or boundaries, or it can. And then also on a personal level, because I tended to reject a lot of the messages about what masculinity was or is or could be that were modeled for me in straight white American culture, at least. I tend to identify a lot more with my mom, and in that way, she's conditioned to be very caretaking as a person. So I tend to be like that. I tend to actually care what others think, and to be kind of caretaking, and it means that I have had to address conflict avoidance in my own development as a person as well. So not that I need to center myself, but that's a little bit of my own background. And beyond that, my training within ritual arts has been especially nourished by earth honoring traditions. I've also drawn a lot of influence from the Dharma and from Islam and Islamic mysticism and Sufism, but especially earth honoring values, right? So that'll be what I want to bring forward to the topic here, and hopefully add to the topic a bit. And I'm a parent, so I happen to be like exhausted right now because our kids got a really unreasonable hour this morning, and so, but I've learned a lot about conflict from having 2 young kids as well. So there's that. Good. I made a few notes, so I will reference them just a bit. For one, in this dialectic of like a lot of the culture, the spiritual oriented culture being overly nice, it would be easy for me to be like, let's be pro conflict and as a compensatory like response. And there's a little bit of that I do want to bring, but I also want to say not all conflict is life affirming or helpful. Like some people are being shot at right now, or worse. And some people are in really entrenched physically and emotionally abusive relationships, or experience systemic oppression and hardship on the daily, or. And some folks experience a tremendous amount of internal conflict to the point of a psychological break with reality, and really deep sense of shame and suicidality, and like very, very fracturingly painful levels of internal conflict. I have no idealization of that. It's very, very awful and painful, and I don't wish that for anyone. So I want to be clear to not have like this generalized conflict is sacred and good view. That's way oversimplified. Conflict is a lot of things, and sometimes it's too much and very unfair. Yeah. Also, having said that there's a ton of systemic like oppression, misogyny, racism, like economic inequality, etc. on Earth. There's also a lot of conflict that is just part of being on Earth. That's like the polar bears are hiding behind your front door, or the difficult neighbors who have the exact same background as you are just being difficult. They're just being difficult people. It's not because they're racist, they're just difficult people. Or you have a troubling spirit. You just kind of spiritually stepped in it, and now the nature spirits are like pestering you. Or, you know, your crops got flooded, something happened, right? So it's not always unfair so much as we're in this ecological, we're in this relational soup with others, and it's not always going to go well. And so in that way, difficulty, and sometimes difficulty with distinct other people, human or otherwise, it's just going to find us, right? So what do we do about that? So I want to head into. I'd say, as someone who's focused mostly in a lot of ways on the study of religion and spirituality in my life, that there's a tendency, now this comes out of my own background mostly, but not only in the United States, there's a tendency for folks to, at least people who identify as more spiritual than religious or something like that, to want to distance a bit from the teachings within established traditions, which are really right there about conflict, and have an identification with what is nice and friendly and kind, and mostly dwell there. That's not bad. I mean, kindness and being friendly is pretty awesome, right? So I'm not like saying that's a bad thing, but what can happen is it can add to this sense that somehow conflict is not sacred, it's not part of the path, it's like a detour, or it's like some annoyance or difficulty, or if it happens to you, shame on you, you must have brought it on you, or there's some sense of like it being less holy, less sacred. And when it starts to feel like that, that's a problem. You like your way of approaching, or one's way of approaching the sacred, is making an unnecessary split, because the teachings really at their heart are full of conflict in any mystical tradition I've ever had any study with or encounter with. And there's no avoiding it. And so there's no need to add an extra layer that it's somehow bad or wrong. It's unavoidable. It's more like, how do we navigate it? How do we hold our values and our connection to the sacred through the tumultuous stuff, right? So I want to center what I'll say around 4 main takeaways that occurred to me when trying to prepare for the time this evening. Like 4 themes that are quite recurrent. One is that if you're not setting out to live an intentional life, it's possible you're going to crash into less conflict, maybe. I mean, you might just get crashed around, you get knocked around by life. But if you say some version of, I want to be a really loving, authentic person with good values, but you could do worse than that. Or if you want to go beyond that and say, I want to be a loving, authentic person who's profoundly awake and an embodiment of non-dual mysticism and clarity and remembrance on a soul level. I want to be very awake. That's on my to-do list. It's like the top on the to-do list. Everything else is kind of connected to that. If you do that, you're absolutely picking a fight. You're going to have conflict. That is a provocative thing to intend with your life. Because all of the stuff that is in tension with that, like relationally, culturally, internally, is going to be like, whoa, that's a threatening intent. I mean, kind of exciting, kind of threatening. Like, if we can wake up and make a really shiny ego out of it, then maybe that's still fine. It's like, oh, but it's a provocative thing. And so what will happen is that whatever stage of development you're at, it's not that it's so linear, but a lot of traditions, and I vibe with this, recognize that there are different stages of awareness. So wherever you happen to be at, moving from where you're at to a stage or stages more aware than where you're at, you're going to encounter gatekeepers to those different stages of awareness, internally and even in the world around you. Internally, it'll look like, oh, you your way of seeing the world needs to go through a bit of a death, or be challenged, or be uprooted in a way. And you probably know that if you've lived through big change. You're like, oh, it's uncomfortable, it's terribly vulnerable. You're the hermit crab between shells. And it's not like the other shell you're looking for is always right nearby. So that in between worldviews vibe can last for a minute. It's vulnerable. But so internally, it can feel vulnerable, but also in terms of just the like esoteric spiritual stuff involved, having some kind of awakening or just spiritual growth or development or like promotion to more responsibility, whatever it is, it's going to resolve certain problems you won't have anymore, but you get a whole new set of problems and a whole new set of adversaries, frankly, and things in the unseen that will like things that weren't problems before become problems, and vice versa. So that like all the literature, even the big stories, the big founders of the popular traditions like Siddhartha or Jesus in the desert, like when the adversaries are coming, when Mara's like, come on, why don't you like be reasonable, stop meditating, man, like you're gonna like something's going to go wrong. You're going to blow a fuse. Like, come on, let's talk. Do anything other than meditating. This is getting very dangerous. Whatever the dialogue is. The sense is that the Siddhartha in that moment is meeting a gatekeeper who's like, don't like, it's going to get weird if you continue it like this, whatever the story is. So you're going to get your personal version of that. But the stories of becoming quite awake are never have the plot line of, and it was really comfortable and free from any conflict. It just doesn't, that's never in the fine print. And so I say that because like right off the bat, and it's not just like the sort of more popular established traditions, also very popular tradition that has been really nourishing and meaningful in my life in a good way is Yoruba traditionalism, or Isheshe, or Orisha tradition, West African Orisha tradition. And more than any other tradition I've learned anything from, what is like one real strong suit of the tradition, it's very beautiful, is the verses of Ifa, of which there are so many. They are just rife with conflict. And often it's not even between the humans. It was like the human and the goats had a conflict, and then the goat and the nettle and the okra went on to have a conflict. And then this whole story unfolded. There weren't even any humans involved, but the okra made offerings and the nettle didn't. And so the goat ate the nettle, and all this stuff played out. But the sense is that everybody's on their trajectory and trying to work their angle and have their best outcome. And this puts folks in tension with one another. You want that? Yeah, I want that too. We have a 2 and a 5-year-old in the house. They're both scorpionic, smart little girls, and they are not always awesome at sharing. It's just like right there in a most fundamental way. And yeah. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. It was, yeah, I got it. That conflict, my point is that conflict is baked in to the process. You have a big opening, you're successful, you have more jealousy, whatever it might be. Things are going to come at you that didn't come at you before. Okay. The second big point, and this is a bit more of a psychological point, and it applies not only to conflict, is that it's useful to take this concept that's popularized around the topic of trauma, or really just nervous system regulation, called the range of tolerance or window of tolerance. And it refers to how much you personally, we can apply it just on a nervous system level, but it's also like on a psychological, spiritual level. what's the range of intensity where you can basically be yourself and hold your center? And because beyond that range, at the very least, you're not your best self always. The sense is that in a more acute way, it can look like being a little dissociated or being a lot dissociated, being overwhelmed, being unable to concentrate, being reactive, getting like big or angry or threatened or shut down, or like hyper or hypoarousal in the trauma language. But when you probably what it feels like to be outside your range. It's where the part of you that's like your basic safety function is like, can we pause? I'm not going to like myself and my choices beyond this point. I need a moment. If you're a parent, you probably like, I don't mean to make it so about parenting. It's just like my daily life. There are moments where I'm like, wow, whatever I say and do next, I will not be a good parent. So I'm just going to get real quiet and just like hold still until that wave passes. So that kind of thing where you're like out of your range. If we can stay in that range, the way that we can show up for conflict, because it's important and necessary for our path, we're going to show up as in the best way that we're able. Things that can expand that range included living in closer connection with the spirits, with the earth, with God, with the divinities, by whatever name, because you essentially get a boost to your nervous system. You can handle more. You still have limits, but you can handle more. And you can also get in the habit of connecting when you need to, be like, "Ooh, I'm flooded. Let me actually connect with the ancestors, ground in. Okay, I'm back in range, barely, but I'm in range. Let's try that again." And so being sensitive to when you're in range and out of range, and actually working to expand your range of tolerance for the energy that accompanies conflict, right? Now, some people can become addicted to the intensity as well. So there's an intensity with conflict. And so some people, I think it's a little bit less common, but I do know people who are conflict favoring. Like for me, I still struggle to like show up as much as I ought to for it. But it's also possible to be a little bit attached to the intensity. But mostly and it's not bad on this topic to be out of range. We just don't want to live there. It takes a toll. It's hard on our nervous system to be out of range a lot. And that's the part of your mind. It's just like, I can't do this all the time. I need to look at changing the conditions in my life. Or maybe this relationship needs to end, or I need a vacation, or I need a break. I can't regularly be in this space. It's wearing on me. And so all that, which is mostly a psychological body awareness thing, it intersects this topic of ritual and the sacred because it is possible to intentionally stretch and cultivate your range by regularly being in relationship with the powers. And they give a kind of boost to what you're able to be with. And that matters, to hold it in a relational way. Be like, I can't hold this all myself. I'm going to make some prayer this morning. I'm going to see if I can't hold my center more than I would had I not done that. A third of fourth principles is how we relate with outer conflict and inner conflict are going to tend to be similar. And this is important. We say a lot about this. If we don't tend to allow for messiness internally, we're going to tend to have that same disdain for difference or for dissent or for people who don't see it the same way we do in the world around us. Now, that could be for anything. You could have very progressive, leftist, like checking all the right boxes kind of views and be very rigid about it. There's an underlying like, others must hold these views or I delete them from the world, kind of, if you hold that energy around it, for one, that's not fun to be around, and it's not actually unusually effective for the larger movement. However, in this context, I'm saying that it also communicates something about your inner life, and that there's probably not a lot of breathing room to be messy and contradict yourself and to have a lot of different perspectives internally either. And in that way, I'm a big fan of approaches to psychotherapy or things like therapy that recognize that we're multivocal. We're not just one self, really. And internal family systems is very popular these days. I have more of a background like voice dialogue or psychosynthesis, depth psychology is like this. There are other models that are parts models, but basically there's a recognition that we're a lot of different voices. And there's not, ideally, there's some mutual respect, if not a functional council among them. But there's never an one voice that is allowed to impose its authority over the others. It's unkind, and it is a rigidity that is not reflected in the other than human worlds in the so-called nature or the ecological framework that ideally we're living from. And if we allow for our sense of identity to become possessed by just one voice within us, we're going to create unconsciously a lot of conflict in our life, for one, because the selves that we have denied or exiled or pushed away they'll mutiny. So you'll have internal conflict as well, but you'll also tend to pull that into your life in some way by I don't mean to be so like law of attraction about it, but if there's a lot we're denying about ourselves, it sets up a kind of energy of I do feel, I guess, that the parts that we deny will just quietly make these phone calls, but can we get a life lesson here, please? Like we need some kind of breakthrough, like really calling in life lesson unconsciously. And because the psyche is, will buck and resist that kind of stuck stance where there's been a hijacking or this like fascist takeover where there's just one single authority that must be obeyed in the psyche. Another way of saying that is if you want to work an edge around getting skillful at conflict, because you're convinced that it's one important life skill on the path of being awake, a great place to start is noticing are there any parts of yourself that you deny and that you just can't tolerate? Because it creates too much internal tension or too much dissonance to just allow them to even have the microphone for a moment. If so, learning to tolerate that is a great practice for being with the messiness in the world. Yeah, okay. The main thing though is the way they inner and outer mirror each other about this topic. Okay, last main point, and we'll angle toward a little bit of dialogue, is from an animist perspective. And when I say animism, I mean earth honoring values, earth honoring ethics that basically say that living humans are only one kind of person. There's lots of other kinds of people. Not all those other people are human. And ideally, we're relating in respectful ways with those others. I draw influence from Graham Harvey's work, who has other influences there. But the value, nothing about the articulation of those values is new in any way, but it's nice to have a clear articulation in English for it, because got a little lost or buried along the way culturally. And but from that basic value set, one of the main takeaways there with conflict is that it's not cool and it's not ethical to we could say dehumanize is a more common way to say it, or depersonify, it's more accurate, or objectify others who you're in conflict with. Meaning, even someone who is someone you really dislike, and maybe they're being like very unethical, or they're an other than human force that's like a really hazardous kind of force in the universe. It's one thing to be like, hey, dangerous force or person, I am seeking to avoid you and or defeat you or contain you or whatever it might be. Very understandable. Like there are lots of forces like that on the move in the world. It's another thing to say, you're fundamentally unreal. I reject your right to exist. I seek to annihilate you and remove you from the universe. We are all related except you. You don't get to be part of what is. I reject your existence in the larger community of beings. That's a different strategy. It's a strategy. And we could frame it maybe as like a kind of symbolic warfare. But when your approach to symbolic warfare is to negate the existence of another, or to belittle and tear down the existence of another, that's a very last resort kind of move. And it's typically not very skillful and not really recommended. I don't want to say it's like a never thing, because who knows? I mean, but generally that stance, like if you're Jesus in the desert and go out on a limb here, and Satan, by whatever name, Shaitan, the tempting force is like, hey man, like stop fasting. Like there's lots of lovely people and money and power, and like let us know what you need. You like, this is very uncomfortable. Come on in. We'll help you out. And just tell us, just make a request. We're recruiting. We'd love to have you on the team. Like you'd be like a star player. And the response isn't like, you don't exist. The response is like, no, thank you. I'm going to do it a different way. I understand. Like you're playing your role, but no thanks. And the distinction there really matters. And it's about not allowing the powers that would function as adversaries in our life to draw us out of our commitment to seeing the world as a whole. And having a view of reality that is inclusive and big enough and generous enough to know that there are forces that are going to position themselves in opposition to us. And when you need to fight, you can still fight to win without diminishing or trying to negate the space in the world for the others. And that skill of how to lovingly have boundaries, I think, is at the heart of a lot of the skills with conflict. And when I was trying to give language to it before the talk, the language that came to me is of like principled inclusivity. Like you're still being inclusive, but in a values-based way, where you're being discerning as well. And another is like discerning kindness. And so in that way, like look at Vajrayana Buddhism, some of the very fierce, wrathful deities, the Dharma protectors, some of the tankas, some of the art, some of the rendering of those deities, it's fierce and very warrior-like. And if you ask practitioners, they'll be like, well, yeah, those are some of the faces of compassion. Sometimes compassion needs to look like that. And so how do we meet real adversaries in our life, including internally, the places that are like, I really resistant to necessary change, or really stubborn, or really previously needed but no longer needed, like protective functions in our psyche, and meet those places with kindness but boundaries at the same time. Those are really important life skills. And maybe you got them. I didn't get them automatically. I had to search about it. And still, it's ongoing. Oh my God, parenting. Oh my God. Like there's like a lot of opportunities to have kindness and boundaries at the same time, like a lot of them. And it's not that different, I don't think. If you're under the Bodhi tree and Mara's like all these other things, and you need to just be like, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. Yeah. You can't have another glass of juice today. No, thank you. It's the same pattern. Okay. Let me pause for questions. I have other things I could say to kind of underscore, but I want to make a space if there are a few folks who want to ask a thing. We will bring it to practice as well. Yeah, Sarah, and then Aaron, I see, or Kareen maybe.
Yeah, I have a question. I really appreciate the it's not ethical to dehumanize others. And there's a big conflict alive in my community. And I've been standing up for treating each other with respect. And I'm being accused of siding with perpetrators because I care. And I don't know what to do about that.
Thanks, Sarah. Without knowing, I may actually know what community you're involved with, I think, but without knowing the details of the situation, I know, generally speaking, that folks who are not, haven't done a lot of reflection around it previously, and or haven't necessarily done a lot of healing around their own trauma, can really easily replicate a punitive worldview that comes out of all the bad stuff of white supremacy and like the prison system in the United States, and the sense of people are disposable. And if you make a mistake or you step out of line, then you need to go away. You can be taken away. And from an abolitionist stance, there's no, if you say we're not going to put people in prison, or the social equivalent of prison, by exiling or canceling them, then there's a need to come up with more nuanced and relational ways to navigate experiences of harm and impact when they happen. And if we're not going to call the police immediately every time someone feels uncomfortable, and therefore reinforce the police state, then there needs to be an ability to have other creative ways to navigate conflict. Now, I don't presume to know the situation, and accusations of someone being a perpetrator can range the whole spectrum from I got my feelings hurt to someone is acutely dangerous. And so on that farther second end of the spectrum, then they do need to definitely be stopped from enacting further harm. And on that first end of the spectrum, there needs to be some perspective and tempering about how we do conflict. I would say generally it's important to be resourced outside the community and to hold your truth, hold your center, and see if anyone is open to actual mediation. But the way that scared inner children who grab the power that is associated with hurting others and cutting them down and having the social power to cancel them, so to speak, or to um, ostracize them. That's a dangerous combination when a place within someone who's been disempowered previously picks up that energy and runs with it without any outer framework for it being tempered. Yeah, that becomes a problem quickly. And so if you're seeing that and naming it, then good for you. And that's a difficult thing because not always, but often there's a lot of scared, painful, black and white thinking beneath it. Yeah. And I don't know the specifics of that situation, so I don't want to presume to weigh in on it. Does that land okay? I mean, I have a lot of feelings about it, of course, yeah, as a general type of process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Thanks. That's hard. And thanks for speaking up. Yeah. Uh, Karen, did you want to share with me?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, just some guidance really, or some ideas on how to have that challenging, kind, boundaried conversation when there's such a fundamental clash of values. You know, how to prepare for that and how to kind of be in kind of appreciative inquiry, if you like, when it's really pushing the values buttons, but you want to be resourced and kind and exploratory.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to generalize without knowing the specifics of a situation, but I think that how we perceive others matters some in terms of the outcome. It's important to know that oftentimes people aren't going to like what we have to say or agree with it or give a damn about it, no matter what we do. So to recognize that there are just going to be limitations. And if we can see others in their best light as part of this bigger network of ancestors and story and everything, and regard them in a generous way, in a patient way, where we actually try to empathize with their concerns. And we're being clear and not so attached to outcome, but being clear from our side and making a prayer about it for best possible outcomes. I think that little bit of extra tending where it's you and your people, seen and unseen, interacting with them and their people, and you have goodwill about it and humility, and you wait for a moment when you feel that, that is probably going to maximize the possibility of something going well. And the only other thing that comes to mind in a general way is like, you might get something like the outcome you want in a different moment than you want it. So it's important to not be attached to people being ready or open to what you'd like to see happen on the timeline that you want it to see happen. Because it just might come later. And so you kind of play the long game and be willing, if you can, to step away if you need. But it's tough. There's no, like, especially when it's families and people you must be around. Often there's no tidy way through it, but you do what you need to do to be true to yourself, hold your center, and try to be kind about it. See people in their best light, I think. And occasionally people are really, I'm going to be teaching about this probably publicly, really, for the first time this coming summer, but teaching a course called Relating with Evil and Malice, because I want to talk explicitly to the reality that some humans and a lot of other forces as well sometimes have little to no empathy and have actual ill will at heart. And that's a thing. That's not everybody. It's not most people, but it's in the mix. So it's important to have that category in how we see the world, so that we know that occasionally it's going to be a good move to not even really try to explain ourselves, but to just quietly, carefully take steps back from a situation because it's really actually unsafe. So that's also a possible outcome. Yeah. Thanks. Kaylee, I see your question as well in the chat. I could speak to it, or you could speak it out loud if you want. It's okay to just answer it, I think. The question is, what practices can be done at home to help integrate our inner selves or parts that are in conflict? You know, what I'd say about that is that's a long-term thing, because our self, in the big sense, we carry within us all the conflict that's also happening in the world. And so there's not a quick resolution to that. And what I'd say beyond that is that there's to not seek integration. And this might be like a semantic thing or something, but to try to integrate or reconcile different selves and voices into one singular self is an act of violence. I know that's a very strong way of stating it. I think it's one of the ways that psychology at times unconsciously replicates a colonialist version of monotheism that is oppressive and singular and reductionistic and mean. It's unkind to try to get our different selves, because we are ecological, we are many things, and we're being honest. To try to get all of that to reconcile into one singular story is unkind. And there's always going to be part of us, if it works, it's just like, oh, I got this nice story. Where's the graffiti coming from? Some bad person's putting graffiti on my really singular story. It's like, yeah, it's you in the night. You're doing it. And so there's like, if you get a really unified story, may it fall apart. It's like, may you be gifted with failure on it, because we want it to stay kind of messy. In that way, we give a lot, like, what I would say is perhaps a non-obvious thing is relieve the pressure of everybody having to get along and make like a really wide pasture. It's like, all right, there are some certain limits. We're not going to go self-destructive, but within big limits, there's not a need to get along. But I wonder if we could just start by occasionally like having little meetups where we get to know each other. So having the different selves or aspects of what we are be in dialogue and be respectful with one another and understand each other's magic, that's great. So in that sense, this like team approach is great. And there's going to be some people that are like, I don't want to be on the team. It's like, all right, well, can we at least talk once a month? Be like, all right, we can do that. So there needs to be a little bit of reporting in, yeah, don't try to integrate things. It's kind of like the United Nations with guns. It's like, you must be part of the team. People who would otherwise probably be part of the team, they're like, now I don't want to. It matters how you approach it. Yeah, good. We should probably get to practice, or else that part is going to get compressed. I see Stephanie around. There's a question. I sometimes will hang out after the hour, but I do want to bring it to practice. And I want to, before we head to practice, which usually is about 10 minutes, let me just recap what, through another lens, I was trying to convey in the talk, which is what we can do is like a general strategy. Some things are live with strong, clear intent with your life in terms of like, do you want to be awake? by whatever name. You don't have to frame it in that language. If you do, be intentional about that and accept that it's going to stir things up. And two, make it a priority to live in connection with the rest of life, because it's going to be more enjoyable. It's messy, but it's going to be more enjoyable. But it will also help to regulate your nervous system and increase your range of tolerance for what you can be with. And being able to sit with more will allow you to avoid less and just be more efficient on fulfilling what you're here to do, because you're not running from the important kinds of conflict. And then the last two things, just a recap, is it's good to have some framework rooted in sacred traditions, or tradition, at least one, about how to fight and how to be in conflict while still respecting the sacredness of others. That's a normal, important life skill. If your spiritual path doesn't affirm that that's one of the kinds of things that can happen, dig a little deeper. It's probably actually in the teachings somewhere. You just might not have encountered it yet. And then finally, practice not rejecting any aspect of what you are. Even if it doesn't mean you let them like take the wheel, but you let them be in the car, and you might have like that little window that separates the back seat, but you let them be part of the story. Once you start exiling parts of what you are, they don't go anywhere. They're nearby. They're just outside the house. So it gets a little wild. Good. Okay. Let's bring it to practice. I'll talk you through a thing. We'll take 10 minutes-ish. Go ahead and bring your attention to your heart, your belly, your feet. Be present in your physical body, however that works for you, maybe through your breath. And while you're doing that, all around you, your spiritual support, your connection to the sacred, however that is for you, let that be present in a felt way. Take a moment from that place of being rooted in your body and connected to the sacred more consciously, and ask that your personal space be clear from interference, and that there be a layer of protection around your space. From that place, ask yourself, with no judgment or no opinion about it, just noticing, what's your current level of commitment to being really awake, really and felt consistent connection to the bigger reality that we're a part of? How much is that a priority in your life? It's not an all or nothing thing, but just notice how important that feels to you right now in your life. And assuming that it's more than nothing, that at least that's a thing. That's something you considered at the very least, if not organized your life around. Notice what it's already cost you. That there are ways that it's already had impact for that to be a consideration. There's probably good stuff too, but what has it cost you in terms of invoking change or discomfort or turbulence in your life? And see if you can take a moment and appreciate yourself for the courage it's taken to invoke that complexity, conflict, turbulence in your life so far, just where it is right now. And take a moment and ask yourself if you knew that being even more committed to being really awake would stir things up even more in ways that are unpredictable. Would you want it? Do you want that? Just, it's not like you're making a commitment now, but just notice it. Try on the question. And without needing to do anything about that inquiry, take a moment and just notice the many, many thousands, really hundreds of thousands and more humans alone on Earth, moving through their life at this time with a great deal of courage, doing things that are bold and ethical and scary and important and kind and vulnerable. Notice just that there's a lot of that happening right now on the earth. See if you can tap in a little bit to that feeling, that spectrum of energy, that vibration. And if you take a moment and just like cozy up a little to that fire and let yourself be warmed by it, let it reverberate with the aspect of you that is courageous in that way. Just take a final moment here and be curious. Are there any places in your life today where that kind of courage might reach, or that it would be good medicine. It'd be a place where you could bring a little courage. Just take a moment and see if there's anything else in this noticing of your level of commitment, noticing choices around it, and noticing available support for being courageous. Is there anything else that is important for you to notice and just be with in this moment? So at your own rhythm, go ahead and thank the one supporting you. If there are things that you're seeing or noticing that are important to remember, it's good to take a moment to make note of those so you actually remember them. The practice, of course, is a bit brief and is just intended to allow a space for you to listen to and access your own intuition. For those of you who are new to the way me or others with the team guide things, it's always the case when we're doing a teaching that we make space for experiential practice and to affirm that we're moving in relationship with many other kinds of forces and people. I hope something landed usefully for you this evening. I'll just remind that we're diving into this particular topic next week for 4 sessions. And Skills for Healthy Conflict and Boundaries course, which will be very skills oriented, a lot like this, but 90 minutes instead of 60, and 2 practices per gathering. And and there are a lot of other offerings, as previously mentioned, the Ancestral course, the animism course. It's practitioners you could work with if you're drawn to ancestral healing work. And I'll be teaching live in person, not only on Zoom, in Hamburg, Germany in July, and then in Beltane in France and southwest of Paris in August. So opportunities to do in-person ritual, which I still, I think, remember how to do. So appreciate you all for your trust and for your presence. We can go ahead and stop recording and finish up in that way. And I don't mind staying for just a few questions. So I'll stay for a few.